In the haunted corners of America's slave past lie stories so disturbing that even time dares not erase them. Tales of vengeance, madness, and unholy justice, where the oppressed found power not through mercy, but through terror. Tonight, we descend into one such story, a tale buried beneath centuries of shame and silence, a story whispered among plantation ruins when the wind howls through the moss-covered oaks. Because not all ghosts wear chains, some still laugh in the darkness. The Mississippi Delta in the late 18th century was a place where the air hung heavy with rot and resentment, where the soil itself seemed to groan under the weight of blood and sweat. The Moore plantation stood on the edge of that suffocating landscape, vast fields stretching beyond the horizon, filled with enslaved men and women who worked until their bones ached and their skin blistered under the relentless southern sun. The house at the center of it all was a grand thing of rotting wood and faded pride, built not for beauty but for dominance. The master, Harold Moore, was rarely present, leaving his property and the lives of his slaves in the hands of one man, Thomas Keene, a cruel overseer whose heart had long since forgotten what mercy felt like. Under his watch, even the whispers of freedom were met with a whip. But among the hundreds who labored, there was one woman who did not quite fit into the usual rhythm of pain and submission. Her name was Eliza Moore. Eliza was unlike the others in both body and presence. She was large, so large that many said she moved like a shadow cast over the fields. Her size made her the target of ridicule and cruelty, both from her fellow slaves, who feared drawing attention to themselves, and from Keene himself, who found in her a perfect vessel for his venom. He mocked her endlessly, calling her the beast of the Delta, forcing her to carry loads far heavier than any person could bear, laughing as she stumbled under their weight. Yet, no matter how harsh the punishment, Eliza never cried, never shouted, never pleaded. Her silence unnerved him. When he struck her, she did not scream. When he cursed her, she did not flinch. Her stillness became something unnatural, something that made even the cruelest slave drivers uneasy. At night, the slaves whispered that Eliza spoke to no one because she was speaking to something else, something that did not belong to this world. They said that when she sat alone by the old cypress tree behind the cabins, her lips moved in prayerless murmurs, her eyes half closed, as if she were listening to distant voices. Some claimed to have seen shadows twist around her feet, dark shapes moving where no light fell. Others said the dogs would never go near her, whining and tucking their tails whenever she passed. But rumors were just survival on the plantation, a way to explain the inexplicable. To Thomas Keene, those whispers were nothing but the foolish chatter of frightened people. Still, deep in the pit of his chest, a small seed of unease had begun to grow. Eliza's presence seemed to draw strange happenings with it. A field once thick with crops began to fail for no reason, the earth turning brittle and dry. Tools vanished from the barn, only to reappear hanging from trees like grim ornaments. At first, Keene blamed the other slaves, punishing them mercilessly. But the more he tried to control the chaos, the worse it became. One morning, the stable boy was found dead, his eyes open and staring at the rafters above him, his body cold though the morning was warm. His mouth had been forced into a smile, a twisted grin that made Keene's stomach tighten. When he asked who might have done such a thing, the slaves avoided his gaze and muttered one name, Eliza. She stood at the edge of the crowd, silent as always, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes reflecting nothing. Keene began to hate her in a way that went beyond cruelty. It became obsession. Every time he saw her, he felt an itch under his skin, a crawling heat in his brain that made his thoughts scatter. He dreamed of her at night, standing at the foot of his bed, her massive frame swallowing the moonlight, her breathing steady and slow. When he woke, the sound of her voice lingered in his ears, though she had never spoken a word to him. The plantation hands said he was cursed, that the devil had marked him through her. He laughed at them, but in the privacy of his quarters, he could not ignore the feeling that something unseen was watching. The mirrors in his room began to fog without cause, his reflection seeming to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. He found himself avoiding her eyes during the day, yet unable to stop thinking about her at night. Eliza continued her silent routine as if nothing had changed. She worked when ordered, ate little, slept less, and spent her nights sitting alone near the fields. But now, even the other slaves kept their distance. It was said that the sound of her humming could bring nightmares, that those who stood too close to her could hear voices whispering through her breath. Keen's hatred reached a fever pitch. He began finding reasons to punish her almost daily, hoping to provoke some reaction, some proof that she was still human. He would shout until his voice broke, lash until his arms grew weak, but Eliza would only stare back at him with that hollow calmness. Her blood ran down her arms, yet her gaze did not waver. And in that stillness, Keen began to lose the fragile grip he had on his sanity. The Moore plantation, once a symbol of control, was now suffocating under an invisible weight. The slaves moved like ghosts, terrified not only of their overseer, but of the woman whose silence was more dreadful than screams. The nights grew longer, the air colder. Thomas Keen's cruelty had created many victims, but none so dangerous as the one who refused to be broken. Eliza's body might have been heavy, but there was something far heavier that lingered in her, something that seemed to drag the whole plantation into darkness. Eliza Moore's silence was not the kind born from fear or weakness. It was an armor, forged in the relentless heat of humiliation and pain. From the day she was taken from her mother's side as a child, she had learned that words could be used as weapons against the powerless. On the Moore plantation, silence was survival, and Eliza had mastered it so completely that even her breathing seemed deliberate, each exhale a controlled act of defiance. The other slaves whispered about it in the dark, wondering if she could even speak at all. Yet there were nights when someone would pass by her cabin and hear the faintest hum, low and deep, like the sound of a storm building beneath the earth. It was not a song of comfort or sorrow, but something older, something that did not belong to this world. The overseer, Thomas Keen, found her silence intolerable. He prided himself on his ability to break spirits, to make even the strongest men beg for mercy. But Eliza did not beg. She did not weep, not even when his whip tore through her back, not when he forced her to crawl through the mud as others watched. It was as if she had swallowed every scream she'd ever wanted to release and locked it inside herself. He called her a monster, a mute cow, a thing unworthy of being called human, yet her eyes, dark and still, followed him everywhere. When he struck her, she stared. When he cursed her, she stared. And slowly, that quiet gaze began to unnerve him more than any words ever could. People began to say that Eliza's silence carried power. They spoke of strange happenings that followed her stillness, of misfortunes that fell upon anyone who mocked or harmed her. One man, a field hand named Amos, had once laughed in her face when Keen forced her to carry barrels twice her weight. The next morning, Amos was found writhing in his sleep, mumbling her name, his eyes rolling back until they showed only white. He recovered days later, but he could not remember what had happened, only that he dreamt of standing in a black field where the earth whispered beneath his feet. After that, no one dared to laugh at Eliza again. It was said that her silence had become a language of its own. The slaves claimed she could hear what others could not. When a child fell sick, she would appear at the doorway before anyone called for help, her face unreadable as she stood beside the fevered bed. When storms approached, she would walk to the cypress tree and sit beneath it for hours, her eyes closed, as if listening to something deep beneath the soil. Once, after a violent thunderstorm, a bolt of lightning struck the barn and set it ablaze. Yet somehow, the fire stopped just short of the slave quarters, dying out as suddenly as it began. That night, while everyone whispered of miracles and curses, Eliza sat outside her cabin with her head tilted toward the sky, the orange glow of the fire reflected in her eyes, her lips curved into what might have been the ghost of a smile. Thomas Keen could not stand it any longer. The woman's quietness began to crawl beneath his skin, a living thing gnawing at his mind. Every time he passed her in the fields, her presence seemed to thicken the air. He began to imagine that her silence was not emptiness, but a sound too low for the human ear, something that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. He started to hear things in the nights, the echo of her slow, steady breathing, the faint shuffle of her steps outside his window when she was nowhere near. Once, he awoke to the sound of his name whispered through the walls of his quarters. He burst outside with his pistol drawn, only to find Eliza standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. Her eyes gleamed in the moonlight, her face expressionless. When he shouted at her to speak, to say something, she only turned and walked away, her footsteps sinking softly into the wet earth. The next morning, the plantation was filled with whispers. Keen had been seen pacing the yard at dawn, his clothes soaked through, his eyes wild with exhaustion. He claimed Eliza had been spying on him, that she was trying to drive him mad. But no one believed him, not even the other overseers who occasionally visited from neighboring estates. They looked at him with cautious pity, for even in a world accustomed to cruelty, there was something unnatural in the way he spoke her name. Eliza, however, continued as if nothing had changed. Her silence became heavier, more deliberate, as though she were holding back a storm that only she could control. She moved through the fields like a dark wind, her eyes sweeping over the rows of cotton, her steps slow but unwavering. The slaves began to follow her example in small ways, speaking less, watching more, carrying their suffering with the same eerie composure. To Keen, it felt as though her quiet had spread across the entire plantation, swallowing it whole. Even the birds seemed to sing less, their songs fading as soon as she passed. As weeks turned to months, Keen's sanity began to fray. He convinced himself that Eliza's silence was a curse meant for him alone, that every unspoken word she withheld carried a piece of his soul away. He started avoiding her in daylight, but his nights were plagued by her presence. In his dreams, she stood over him, her shadow stretching across the walls, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He would wake drenched in sweat, clutching at his chest as if her silence had seeped into his lungs. He began to dread the sound of nothing, the absence of noise that filled the plantation after sundown. He would shout at the slaves to sing, to speak, to break the unbearable quiet, but even their songs could not drown out the echo of Eliza's stillness. Her silence had become a haunting presence, wrapping itself around the plantation like a fog that no one could escape. The men grew restless, the women prayed in hushed tones, and Keen's rage deepened into something far more dangerous. He started carrying his whip everywhere, not out of necessity but fear, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. And still, Eliza did not speak. She only watched, her eyes as calm and endless as the dark waters of the swamp beyond the fields, her silence swelling until it filled every corner of the Moore plantation, a suffocating force that pressed against the hearts of all who dared to listen. The descent of Thomas Keen began like a sickness that no one could see but everyone could feel. At first, it was in the small things. His voice would falter when he barked orders, his hands would tremble when he raised the whip, his eyes darting toward shadows that no one else could see. He became restless at night, pacing the veranda with a lantern, muttering to himself that the air smelled different, that something in the soil was wrong. The men who worked under him began to exchange uneasy looks. For Keen had been a man of terrifying certainty, the kind who ruled with violence and sleepwalking confidence. But now, the fire in his eyes had dimmed into a feverish glint, something unstable, something hunted. He told himself that it was exhaustion. The summer heat was unbearable, the mosquitoes thick as smoke, the weight of command endless. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the weather or the work that gnawed at him. It was her. Eliza. That silent mountain of flesh who never cried, never begged, never gave him the satisfaction of her fear. When he looked at her, he saw something he could not name, and it unsettled him more than any blade could. He began to imagine that she was mocking him without moving a muscle, that her very stillness was an act of defiance designed to hollow him out from the inside. Her eyes, dark, steady, and unreadable, haunted him. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that she was standing outside his window, watching. Sometimes he would fling open the shutters, only to see the fields swaying gently beneath the moon, the world silent but for the croaking of frogs. And yet he could swear he still felt her gaze. Days bled into each other, and his mind began to unravel. He started hearing laughter, low, breathy, drawn-out sounds that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. He thought it was the slaves at first, mocking him in secret. But when he burst into their quarters with his pistol raised, the noise would vanish. He found himself whispering to empty rooms, calling her name as though she were some phantom he needed to summon to prove he wasn't mad. The plantation's dogs began to act strange, growling at corners, barking into the dark, refusing to go near Eliza when she walked by. A horse went wild in the stables, breaking its own neck against the beams after a night of shrill, mindless screaming. The workers said the overseer was cursed, that the devil had come to claim him, but Keen would not hear it. He told himself he was still in control, even as his reflection in the mirror began to change. One morning, he caught sight of himself while shaving, and for a fleeting second, the face staring back did not seem like his own. His eyes looked hollow, the skin around them pale and stretched. He dropped the razor, cutting his palm, and when he blinked, the image was normal again. Still, he could not shake the feeling that something inside him was shifting. The house itself seemed to be breathing now, the floorboards sighing beneath his feet, the walls groaning when the night wind pressed against them. Even the air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if the plantation was slowly closing in on him. He began keeping his pistol beside his bed, convinced that one night Eliza would come for him. The whispers followed him wherever he went. In the fields, he heard his name in the rustle of the cotton. In the woods, the crows called with voices that almost sounded human. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and his temper grew more violent by the day. One of the younger field hands dropped a bucket near him and Keen snapped. He struck the boy so hard his skull split, then stood over the body in silence, panting, staring at the blood pooling into the dirt. The others froze, too afraid to move, but Keen's face was blank, his mind elsewhere. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. He said he heard laughter again, faint and distant, and that it came from the fields. By this point, even the other overseers avoided visiting the Moore plantation. The rumors had spread beyond the delta, stories of a cursed woman, a mad overseer, and nights filled with ghostly screams. Keen found himself alone more often, the slaves working in silence, their eyes lowered, their movements mechanical. He hated the quiet, yet it was the only sound that surrounded him now. The voices no longer came from the outside but from within. They whispered through his thoughts, murmuring her name over and over until he could barely stand it. Sometimes he caught glimpses of her in places she could not be, her silhouette at the end of the hall, her face reflected in the glass of a lantern, her shadow stretching across his door when she was still in the fields. Sleep abandoned him completely. He wandered the plantation at night, clutching his lantern like a talisman, calling her name into the darkness. He thought if he could confront her, if he could force her to speak, it would break the spell. But every time he approached her cabin, something stopped him. The closer he came, the colder the air became, until his breath fogged and his hands trembled. He swore he could hear a faint humming from within, the same low sound that had once been mistaken for prayer. It wasn't a tune, it was more like the sound of wind blowing through hollow bones. He would retreat, shaking, muttering to himself that he was not afraid, though the lie tasted bitter in his mouth. The hallucinations grew worse. He began to see figures moving in the corners of his vision, their faces blank, their eyes wide. The plantation's crops began to die again, not from drought but from rot, black veins spreading through the leaves overnight. The slaves said the land was rejecting him, that Eliza's silence had called upon something that would not stop until the plantation and its keeper were both swallowed by madness. Keen could not bear to hear his own name anymore. He scratched it off documents, off the walls of his office, muttering that he no longer belonged to himself. By autumn, his mind was a ruin. He barely spoke to anyone except the ghosts in his head. His clothes hung loose on his body, his eyes ringed with dark hollows. He took to staying in his quarters, sitting in the dark with the curtains drawn, listening to the sound of her humming somewhere beyond the fields. Sometimes it grew louder, sometimes softer, but it was always there, steady, patient, and inescapable. It became the rhythm of his unraveling, the music of his descent into madness, until he could no longer tell where her silence ended and his own began. The night of madness began like any other, thick with the choking humidity of late summer, the air humming with insects, and the moon hanging swollen and red above the cypress trees. The plantation was quiet except for the restless murmur of the slaves in their cabins, the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a faint wind. Thomas Keen sat alone in his quarters, a bottle of whiskey clutched in his trembling hand, his face pale and slick with sweat. He had not slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, his beard unkempt, his mind teetering on the edge of something vast and black. The laughter had started again that evening, faint at first, like a woman chuckling far away, but as the night deepened it grew louder, echoing through the wooden walls like a taunt. He had locked his doors, shuttered the windows, yet it still crept in, curling around him like smoke. He whispered to himself that it was only the wind, that she could not be here, but the sound of her laughter made the lie crumble before it could leave his tongue. Outside, the plantation dogs began to howl, their cries long and mournful. The slaves stirred in fear, some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers under their breath. They knew something had shifted in the air, something dark and deliberate. The overseer's madness had been building for weeks, and tonight the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The moonlight poured across the fields in a ghostly silver, and there, near the edge of the trees, a shape stood, large, still, unmistakable. Eliza. She was watching the main house, her figure casting a long shadow that stretched across the dirt like a spreading stain. Keen stumbled to his feet, his heart pounding with rage and terror. He could feel her gaze even through the walls, could hear her silence roaring louder than thunder. He grabbed his whip, then his pistol, and staggered outside, shouting her name into the night. His voice broke as it carried over the empty fields, swallowed by the heavy air. "Show yourself," he screamed, his words slurred with drink and fear. For a moment, nothing moved. The cicadas went still. The air itself seemed to pause. Then came the faintest hum, low and steady, drifting from the direction of the fields. It was the same sound that had haunted him for months, the same rhythm that had burrowed into his dreams. He followed it, stumbling through the rows of cotton, the stalks brushing against his legs like cold hands. The closer he came, the louder it grew, until it filled his ears, his head, his entire body. He saw her standing near the cypress tree, her massive form bathed in pale light. She did not move as he approached, did not speak when he cursed her name. Her eyes, dark and hollow, reflected the moon like twin pools of glass. He raised the whip, his arm shaking violently, but before he could strike, a sound burst from his throat, a cry not of anger, but of terror. For in that moment, the air around him shifted, and he swore he saw faces flickering in the shadows behind her, dozens of them, maybe more. Faint outlines of men, women and children, their bodies shimmering like smoke. They stared at him with lifeless eyes, their mouths moving in silence. His pistol dropped from his hand. He backed away, whispering prayers he had long forgotten, but the figures moved closer, their forms bending and twisting like mist. Eliza did not move, but her lips parted slightly, and though no sound came out, Keen could feel the words inside his skull, burning like fire. He ran. His feet tore through the dirt as he stumbled back toward the house, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The laughter followed him now, louder than ever, echoing from the trees, the earth, the sky. He slammed the door behind him, bolting it shut, his chest heaving. The lanterns flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. He turned and froze. The mirrors in the room were covered in condensation, fogging over though the air was dry. He wiped one with his sleeve, and what he saw made him stagger backward. His reflection was not his own. It was Eliza's. Her eyes stared out from the glass, unblinking, her mouth curved in a faint smile. Behind her reflection, the smoky outlines of the dead swirled like a tide. Keen screamed and threw the lamp, shattering the mirror into pieces. The flames caught on the drapes, spreading quickly across the room, but he did not notice. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the voices filled it. Hundreds of them, whispering his name in unison. The fire climbed higher, devouring the walls, the ceiling, the air. The slaves could see the glow from their cabins, orange and fierce, and they gathered outside, watching in silence as the main house began to burn. Through the crackle of flames came the sound of shouting, then laughter, wild, hysterical laughter that did not sound entirely human. Some said it was Keen's voice, others swore it was hers. The windows exploded outward, shards of glass raining down like falling stars. In the chaos of firelight, a figure was seen moving through the doorway, staggering into the open. It was Keen, his clothes blackened with soot, his hair singed, his eyes wide with madness. He clawed at his own face, screaming that she was inside him, that she would not stop whispering. He fell to the ground, convulsing, laughing and sobbing all at once, his voice rising and falling in jagged bursts. The slaves watched in frozen horror as he began to crawl through the dirt toward the fields, his fingers digging into the earth, his body trembling violently. He was calling Eliza's name now, not with hatred, but with something that sounded almost like pleading. Behind him, the fire continued to consume the house, its light throwing monstrous shapes across the yard. Some claimed that as he crawled, they saw Eliza standing at the edge of the flames, her face calm, her eyes reflecting the inferno. She did not move to help him, nor did she turn away. She simply stood there, silent, watching him unravel. When dawn broke, The house was nothing but ash and smouldering wood. The fields were damp with dew, the sky grey and heavy. Keane was found in the dirt near the cypress tree, his hands clawed into the ground, his eyes open but empty. His mouth was stretched into a terrible grin, and though his lips were dry, they looked as if they had been moving all night long, shaping her name again and again. Those who found him said his face looked almost peaceful, but his mind was gone, his laughter still echoing faintly in the still air. And though the fire had died, the faint scent of smoke lingered over the plantation, as if the night itself refused to forget what it had witnessed. After that night, the Moore plantation was never the same. The once booming fields lay abandoned, the soil dry and brittle, as if it had been stripped of life itself. The mansion, or what was left of it, stood like a hollow skeleton against the horizon, its charred beams pointing toward the sky like blackened bones. The overseer, Thomas Keane, remained alive in body, but not in mind. He was found wandering near the fields at sunrise, muttering nonsense and laughing under his breath, his eyes wide and unseeing. The doctor who came from the next county refused to stay long. He said there was something in Keane's expression that chilled him to the marrow. He spoke to the master briefly, warned him that no man could recover from a madness so deep, and left before the sun had fully risen. Keane was locked in a small storage room behind the burnt remains of the overseer's quarters, where he sat rocking back and forth, whispering Eliza's name over and over, as if he were calling her or pleading for her forgiveness. The slaves no longer worked the land. They moved quietly, their faces drawn, their bodies tense with the weight of fear. Some claimed they could still hear her humming at night, that low, rhythmic sound that once drifted across the fields like a hidden heartbeat. Others swore they had seen her walking near the cypress tree, her silhouette framed against the dim light of the moon, her figure heavy but graceful, her steps soundless. The plantation master tried to bring in new workers, but none stayed longer than a week. Tools went missing, crops failed without reason, and livestock turned violent or died without wounds. Word spread quickly through the delta, no one would go near Moore plantation after dark. Eliza Moore herself had vanished the morning after the fire. No one saw her leave, and no one could say where she went. Her cabin was untouched by the flames, her few possessions still neatly arranged inside. A folded blanket, a tin cup, and a bundle of dried herbs tied with string. Some believed she had escaped into the swamps that bordered the property, that she had simply walked into the mist and disappeared. But others whispered that she had never left at all, that her spirit still lingered among the ruins, watching, waiting. At night, travelers passing along the old road would see a shape moving near the fields, too large to be a woman, too solid to be a shadow. Some said she sang to herself in a voice so deep it seemed to rise from the ground. As the years passed, the plantation decayed. Vines crawled up the broken walls, and weeds swallowed the once ordered rows of cotton. The master's family moved away, leaving the estate to rot. But even in abandonment, it was not silent. Locals claimed that when the wind blew from the south, they could hear faint laughter echoing from the ruins, laughter that did not sound like joy, but like something darker, mocking, knowing, endless. Hunters reported seeing strange lights near the cypress tree, glowing orbs that flickered and vanished when approached. One man swore that he heard footsteps behind him as he crossed the field one night, but when he turned, there was no one there. Only a deep indentation in the soil, as though something massive had been standing just beyond his sight. Stories began to spread, changing with every retelling but always circling back to Eliza. Some said she had made a pact with spirits older than the earth, that her silence had been a prayer spoken in reverse, a call to forces that thrived on suffering. Others said her strength had been her curse, that her pain had soaked so deeply into the land it became part of it. In the nearby towns, mothers warned their children not to mock those who suffered, not to laugh at the weak, for Eliza's vengeance waited for the cruel-hearted. They said if you listened too closely on a windless night, you could still hear her breathing in the distance, slow and steady, as if she was still watching the world that had wronged her. Decades later, when new owners tried to rebuild on the land, their workers fled within days. One man claimed he saw a woman standing in the middle of the field, her eyes reflecting light though the sky was dark. Another woke screaming in the night, clawing at his chest, saying he dreamed of a face so close he could feel its breath and that it whispered his name without sound. They left the next morning, refusing even to collect their pay. The new owner sold the property within a month, and no one ever tried again. The plantation was left to the swamp, its stories swallowed by moss and time. Those who live nearby still avoid the area. Even generations later, the name Eliza Moore is spoken only in hushed tones. They say that on certain nights, when the fog rolls thick across the delta, you can see her walking among the ruins of the fields, her heavy figure illuminated by moonlight. Her skin glows faintly, her dress hanging in tatters, her eyes dark as river water. She hums the same tune that once echoed through the plantation, and if you hear it too closely, your dreams will fill with whispers you cannot escape. Some claim she seeks those who carry cruelty in their hearts, that her spirit finds them and mirrors their sins until madness takes root. Others insist she is not vengeful at all, only bound to the place where she suffered, repeating her final moments in an endless loop of sorrow and rage. Over time, the legend of Eliza Moore became a tale told around fires, a warning woven into the fabric of the South. But those who have walked near the ruins know that it is more than a story. They speak of the way the air grows colder near the old cypress tree, how even the insects fall silent as if the earth itself is listening. They talk about the footprints that sometimes appear in the soft dirt after rain, large, deep, facing toward the plantation and never away from it. They talk about how birds refuse to nest there, how no vegetation grows where her cabin once stood. And always, they speak of the humming, that same low, haunting sound that rises just before dawn, drifting across the dead fields like a voice carried by memory itself, heavy and eternal, as if Eliza Moore still waits in the shadows, her silence lingering long after the last scream faded from the night.